everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to start with a couple of individual questions to each of you, and then we're going to open up to discussion. And then finally, we're going to have questions from the audience. First, Steve. As chair of the State Assembly Education Committee and co-chair of the task force that created community education councils, could you speak a little bit about what political forces led to the adoption of mayoral control and the elimination of the community school boards? And did it all turn out the way that you expected?
The answer to your last question was no. The answer to your first several part questions is more difficult to explain, but let me spend a couple of minutes maybe providing the context for really the reason why we're here tonight, and the context being what was the thought process of the state legislature back in 2002 that led to mayoral control as we know it today. When I became chair of the Assembly Education Committee in 1995, having been a product of the New York City public schools, having been a resident of New York City my whole life, and not only a political representative, but a citizen and an observer of the scene, I came to the conclusion pretty quickly, which I think was about the same conclusion that most people had arrived at by 1995, which was that as well-intended as it was, the decentralization law that was established and voted into law in 1969 and 1970 had not worked very well. It certainly that law had not worked as the framers of that law had intended it to. And here we were now, 25 years later, with a lot of problems in the education system. And one of the questions that frequently would be asked of me when I first became chair of that committee is, well, if the law is not working, well, why don't you change it? And in my opinion, the reason why it had not been changed many, many years before I had become chair of the committee is that education is a tough issue. It's one of those real hot button issues, and almost whatever you do in public education policy, you're going to meet with resistance from about a third or more of the people of the city of New York, no matter what you do. There's going to be significant opposition to what you are trying to do. Add to that all of the variety of special interest groups that have a bearing on education policy, because although the decisions about state education law is left to the state legislature, which is another question, should it be up to the city council or not, but mayoral control and New York City education is the province of the state legislature. It's part of the state education law. It isn't just the state legislators who were involved in that decision-making about what kind of a governance system would exist in New York City. It was also the unions, the various unions involved in public education, not just the teachers, but a variety of unions had a vested interest and certainly a loud voice. It was certainly parents, it was certainly organized education community groups. It was certainly other elected officials from the city of New York and elsewhere. And I think what I realized very quickly was that the reason why the decentralization law had not been seriously addressed in all those years, long after we knew that there were very serious problems, is because it was a quagmire. Whatever you did, whatever you tried to do, you were going to be met with a lot of pushback, and I think that there was a lot of resistance to even trying to do anything. The path of least resistance is to do nothing. And perhaps I could say this now, the state legislature, but the state legislature is not that much different from other legislative bodies, normally takes the path of least resistance. And in this case, doing nothing for many, many years was the result. I didn't want that to be the result of my time as chair of the Education Committee. So we set about to change it, or at least to decide what to do with it. And I think we did it, at least the process, I think we did the right way. We held public hearings across the city, in every borough. We had 50 hours of public input, public hearings. And we got a variety of opinions, we got a variety of input. I also think that by 2001, 2002, there had been a general consensus out there, certainly among the editorial boards, that also certainly play a role in this. The New York Times, the Post, the Daily News, that there was a general consensus that it was time to move away from decentralization and to vest in the hands of a mayor more authority to run the system. And to some extent that makes sense for New York City. Why does it make sense for New York City? New York City is different in many respects from most every other school district in the state. By the size, by the involvement of the mayor. The mayor, of course, controls the budget with the city council. But he didn't have a whole lot to say about policy, about how that money would be spent. And let me just take you back for a moment. Just remember where we were in 1999, 2000, 2001, Mayor Giuliani was mayor. But it wasn't just Giuliani. If you remember, when there were fights, and there were fights all the time about education, the problem was there was no clear lines of authority. You had the mayor complaining and fighting with the chancellor. And the mayor would have a position, but the chancellor wouldn't have to adhere to the mayor's position because the chancellor was hired by the Board of Education. And the Board of Education was comprised of 2 appointments by the mayor and 5 appointments by borough presidents. And then you had the local school structure, where you had local community school districts and their superintendents. But the superintendents of the local community school districts were not answerable to the mayor or the chancellor or the Board of Education, because they were hired by the locally elected school boards. So you had a system that evolved over the years that was largely incoherent. You have the mayor with some power, the chancellor with some power, local community school district superintendents with some power, local community school boards with some power, and whenever anything went wrong, as it frequently did, all you saw were people pointing fingers in different directions. It's his fault. No, it's her fault. Don't blame me. I'm not responsible. I don't have the power. She has the power. And the fights that went on that occupied the front pages of all of the newspapers, the fights between mayors and chancellors that were very debilitative in my judgment of public education generally, it was all very destructive. What we wanted to do, what we set about to do, was to make an incoherent system coherent, where there were lines of accountability and responsibility. And clearly it was our intention to give to the mayor significantly greater powers, which we did. But I can tell you this. It was never the intention of the legislature, certainly not mine, and it's not in the law. If you actually read the law, there was never an intention to make the mayor autonomous.